ask questions. So we can jump right into it. Our agenda for today is going to be, next slide. Awesome. So, we'll get a couple of updates from myself, Councilman Conway, and then we'll get a brief, or maybe not brief, a thorough presentation from our budget team from BBMR. So Mira Green and Mara James will be reporting out from BBMR and the Department of Finance. We'll then jump into a Q&A, and then we will close. So with that, a couple updates. So, we've been incredibly busy, myself, my team, Vidashani, David, of course, still chairing the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee, and we've had definitely the busiest committee on City Council. Probably about 40% of bills are coming through the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee, and we've looked at everything from issues having to do with safety down to issues having to do with water bills and some of the initiatives that we push forward on my end. So, some of the ordinances that we have coming up, I put forward an ordinance to divest the city's retirement funds from fossil fuels, realizing that, especially as a waterfront city, as global warming and climate change continue to impact our planet, we as a city have to make a stance. And so we've got a bill that'll be considered just this week that'll be looking into divesting from fossil fuels from 200 of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world. I also put forward a bill that would create the Office of Emergency Management as a new city agency. It would make them independent. Currently, at the moment, it exists somewhere between the fire department and the mayor's office. It's budgeted out of the fire department, but operates out of the mayor's office. It has a sort of fractured structure. And as you guys are all aware, with the COVID-19 pandemic and all the coordination that we've had to do as a city, our Office of Emergency Management is incredibly important towards making sure that we're prepared, making sure that we have proper plans and resources to respond as a city. So those two things will be coming forward very soon. We also put through a couple of resolutions, one being a dig into the concept of crime prevention through environmental design. The idea being here that when you activate places and get legitimate activity in areas where you have crime at the moment, whether violent or property crime, you can see a decrease in that crime. So, we're going to be looking into some of that and some of the tactics and strategies that we can use in our fight against crime. This is an approach that's been used across the world and has found a lot of success. And it's one that we actually use here as well, but we can really begin to embellish that work there. Also, we'll be digging into domestic violence. I put forward a resolution looking into the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on domestic violence in the city. For the last year and a half now, we've all been locked in our homes, and I know that this has been incredibly challenging on families, on couples, and understanding that challenge on women and men who are in violent relationships. I think is important in providing support and making sure that our city can respond appropriately, and also that our partners in responding to domestic violence have the tools and ability to respond to the increase in domestic violence. We've seen a significant increase during the pandemic. One of the big pieces that we're really looking into now is our ARP funding, the American Rescue Plan. The federal government is, very aggressively trying to stimulate the economy with the American Rescue Plan. Baltimore City in particular is going to be receiving $670 million, which is a game changer for our city. if we use those funds appropriately. Some of the projects that we're looking into is strengthening our York Road corridor, being it is the backbone, certainly for the district, but in many ways also for the city. And also supporting some of the middle neighborhood initiatives in our district. Realizing that we have a lot of investment happening around our schools, Gilbans Elementary and Wall Street Carter, and supporting those neighborhoods, incentivizing homeowners in those neighborhoods, helping them take care of their homes in those neighborhoods, I think will go a long, long, long way towards strengthening the district and strengthening the city. To that end, also, we know that there are a number of issues tied to stormwater, flooding that happens during rain events, that can be really, really, really bad, not only in the street when we have flooding, but also backups in people's basements as a result of our stormwater systems being overwhelmed. So, we'll be looking into those opportunities and making sure that where possible, that ARP funding can be helpful in those areas. Next slide. Cool. Some of the things that we've been really digging into in the 4th District, just a couple of short weeks ago, for those who weren't able to make it, we had a home repair workshop that helped people in the district identify and connect with some of the city's programming to improve their homes, to make sure that their home is being properly taken care of. I also learned that we have a huge problem with raccoons apparently here in the Northern District. I want to say maybe 20% of the people there had raccoons breaking into their homes. If you are on the call and that's happening to you, please let my office know, and we'd be happy to connect you to help. But I think folks found it really, really helpful just understanding some of the programs that are available and some of the options available. This picture here is a crosswalk repainting that we did at Beaumont in York. Had, I want to say, maybe somewhere between 30 and 50 volunteers come out that day and help paint the sidewalks, and just really begin to appreciate some of the great work that we're doing along the corridor. It looks great. If you haven't had a chance to cross the street there, you might want to do so a little more often. You can get inspired by the new artwork. So also, we are looking to do some work on the east side, helping to activate the Alameda Shopping Center, realizing that that is a big space that folks want to find inviting, helpful. And so we're working with Glen Oaks, Woodburn Heights, and Leaf Tide Capital to activate that space. We're going to be hosting an event during July 4th weekend to get people out of their homes and to get them out in the streets. So we continue to meet with residents and business owners to activate the district. I'm sure everybody and their mom wants to get outside. I can assure you I do. And I've been taking every opportunity that I can now that the weather's warm and before the cicadas completely take over. But yeah. To that end, as we get out there, I want to continue to remind folks, to take the opportunity and get vaccinated. I would encourage you to go on the health department's website and find an available time. There are tons of opportunities now to get vaccinated. The lines are not nearly as long, but certainly the urgency is especially still there. If you want to be safe, if you want to feel confident, you would want to feel comfortable going outside, there's no better way to do so than to get vaccinated. So my entire family's been vaccinated. My whole staff has been vaccinated. We're all safe, healthy. I'm able to hug people again, which I can really appreciate. I can shake hands again. And as a politician, I think that might be important. So I encourage everyone to get vaccinated. This is an excellent opportunity to do that now that we're opening up. With that, before I give you contact information for folks in my office, I want to give folks just a couple of more updates. So I want to commend, first, I want to let folks know that we have a new major in the Northern District. Former Captain, now Major Shorter, is our new major in the Northern District. So I really want to congratulate Major Shorter, and really looking forward to working with him in his new capacity. I also want to commend the Northern District for excellent work on a few cases that happened very recently, some violent cases that they were able to act swiftly and to find justice in those cases. So our police department is doing great work, being responsive, being available, and I just want to make sure I commend and recognize the police department in that instance. So to that end, I'll move on and just want to share, as always, my office is always available. You can call the office number 410-396-4830, or you can always reach me by email, mark.conway@baltimorecity.gov. And you'll often hear or be responded to by one of my staffers, Vidashani and David. Their information is available right on the screen. I encourage you also to follow us on Twitter. It's Mark Conway 4th, and to also sign up to our Facebook account where we regularly put updates to things that are going on, both in the community, but also in our committees and things that folks in the 4th might just want to know about. But then also, opportunities for folks to get engaged and get involved. So with that, I want to give I want to introduce our guests, and I want to, one more person. We have a new intern, sorry. We have a new intern, Kara. Kara Casas, she's a student over at Loyola and just joined us yesterday. And so, really excited to work with her. Excuse me, she just joined us today. Just really excited to work with her, and you guys will have an opportunity to meet her at some point, especially as we open up and we're here in person. So with that, I want to move on and introduce folks from the budget to jump into our fiscal 22 budget briefing. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot we have one more piece. So just some upcoming events. So first, on June 2nd, the Govans Farmers Market will be opening up. So great opportunity to get some fresh food, fruits and vegetables. So I encourage folks to come out then. On June 5th, the Loch Raven will be doing a code inspection walk. And then we are always hosting bi-weekly YRP cleanups, one of which was the crosswalk that we showed a little bit earlier. So I encourage you guys to get out there. It's a great opportunity. We were cutting down some vines as well earlier. Great opportunity to beautify the neighborhood, to get involved, to meet people, to get out of your house, to get out of your house, to get out of your house, and to do so safely, of course, because you're going to get vaccinated. And then finally, I alluded to earlier, on the 4th of July, that weekend, we're going to hold a block party at the Alameda Shopping Center. We're trying to get folks out of the house and activate our space, claim our space, and get people, to have a little bit of fun after we've been indoors for so long. So with that, are there any more slides? All right, cool. There we go. So just going to jump into now the fiscal 22 budget briefing. So of course, as folks may or may not know, the City Council will be considering the budget for approval in the first week of June. And so we'll have lots of long meetings diving into all the particulars of the budget. I encourage folks to take a look at it, but even more, I encourage you to pay attention as we hear from Mira and Mara about some of the ins and outs of the budget and what we'll be looking into. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mira and Mara.
Great, thank you, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for having us today. I really appreciate the invite to be here and talk a little bit about the budget and answer any questions. Councilman, I was thinking about you the other day when I was planting trees from Tree Baltimore as a part of an institution I'm connected to. And so I appreciate your former work with Tree Baltimore and thought of you in that moment. But again, thank you. My name is Mira Green. I'm an assistant budget director for the city's budget office. I'm a resident with my family in District 14, so not too far away. And I've presented to this district in the past, and thank you again for having us today. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of the budget and answer any questions. Also, Feel free to put questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. And Mara on my team is also standing by. You can see her up above there to answer any questions that come up in the chat as well. So to get started, again, the agenda for our overview of the budget is to just give you a high-level overview of the next year's budget, which, as the councilman referenced, will be going to City Council for approval with a set of hearings beginning next week. The primary focus of this presentation will be on the operating budget, which is the budget that our office oversees. But we can shed any light on the capital budget, you know, as questions arise there as well. Talk generally about the budget process. Again, give you highlights of the fiscal 22 recommended budget, and give you some highlights on how the federal aid the city has received in response to the pandemic is being used as well. So let's jump into the next slide. So in terms of you know, a bird's level view, a high level overview of the budget, the fiscal 22 budget in terms of size totals $4.3 billion, with about close to 89% of that appropriation in the operating budget plan, and about 11% in the capital budget plan. The capital budget plan varies a little bit from year to year depending on cyclical debt service, but that is what the budget looks like in terms of the breakdown for next year. So as a lot of you might be familiar with, in the operating budget, you have all of those funds due to be spent on city programs, services, staff, and supplies. So all those costs that are needed in order to run the daily city operations. The capital budget is where we budget for infrastructure projects and large capital improvements to city facilities or other city assets. And it also might include renovations and replacements, for example, to libraries, for example, that are considered long-term investments for the city. On the next slide. So again, just a very high level. You know, we get questions about, well, what is operating? What is capital? Operating, again, we have a picture of a swimming pool, you know, are all the funds that are, you know, utilized in the budget to staff a pool, to run programs in a pool, for example. And the capital is, you know, budget would include improvements to the pool itself. So if a pool was to be renovated, that typically would live in the capital budget, just to give you a sense of which falls where. On the next slide. Again, this is just another visual, you know, illustrating that in the case of the Department of Public Works, for example, the operating budget would fund the collection of trash and recyclables and all the trash trucks you see in your neighborhood picking up trash, whereas the capital budget would fund, you know, all of the pipes and stormwater and wastewater and water pipe improvements that you see going on around the city, especially Greenmount Avenue. I know that affects your community. Those types of improvements will be included in the capital budget. So just another visual to break down capital versus operating for you. On the next slide. So in terms of who prepares the budget in the city, so the budget preparation happens as a part of the Department of Finance. And the operating budget is prepared specifically by my office, by the budget of the Bureau and the Management Research, which is a bureau within the Department of Finance. And the Department of Planning, which is not under finance, but a separate agency and a separate department, is responsible for preparing the capital budget. So we each have our own process in terms of how the budget comes together in slightly different timelines, but that is how the oversight works in terms of the formulation of the budget. And in the Department of Finance itself, at the leadership level, they're charged with overseeing things like setting tax rates, setting debt levels, and looking at the even bigger picture financial planning for the long term for the city. In terms of the next slide, so we'll just go to an overview of the operating budget, revenues, and expenditures. So this first slide here looks at where the money comes from, in other words, revenue. And so the city's largest source of revenue is revenue into the general fund, which you can see next year makes up about $2.0 billion, or just over half of the operating budget. So it's the largest fund in the budget by far. Grant funds make about up about 32.2% of the budget. So the city gets a number of grants from the federal government, from the state of Maryland, and from private foundations or other private sources as well. And then the enterprise funds is the next largest source of revenue in the city budget. Enterprise funds include the wastewater fund, the water utility fund, the stormwater fund, and the conduit fund, which represent user fee-based revenue sources. So you pay your water bill, it goes into the enterprise fund, for example. As I mentioned, the city's general fund is the largest fund in the operating budget. It includes all the local taxes paid by residents, for example, property taxes by businesses and visitors that pay taxes specific to them. And this is the pot of funds that policymakers have the most discretion and flexibility over in deciding how those dollars are spent. Grant funds are legally required or restricted to be spent typically on specific programs or initiatives. And so with those funds, the city has less flexibility in terms of how those dollars are spent. They're directed towards specific programs. And with regard to the enterprise funds, there too, the city doesn't have broad flexibility over those funds. Those funds are dedicated specifically to the activities related to the collection of those funds. So water utility fund revenue, for example, can only be spent on programs related to improving water quality or water infrastructure in the city. On the next slide, just to give you a breakdown of that $2.0 billion general fund revenue expected next fiscal year. Let's see, property taxes makes up about half of that, so about $1.0 billion is what the city expects to receive in property taxes next fiscal year. The next largest source of revenue into the general fund is income tax, and that makes up just under 20% of the general fund revenue. Other revenue sources into the city's general fund include other local taxes, state highway user revenue that we get from the state as our share of motor vehicle related fees paid by citizens. There's also state aid that the city receives. Charges for services makes up a small percent of the general fund revenue. And then a variety of other income sources categorized as everything else or all other on this chart here. The next slide. So we organize the budget in our publications and for presentation purposes into different priority outcomes. And the 5 outcomes you see in front of you here note the high-level strategies that the current mayor wishes to achieve. And so you can see that the budget is organized categorically around these high-level goals. So prioritizing our youth, equitable neighborhood development, building public safety, clean and healthy communities, and responsible stewardship. So within each of those priority outcome areas, the city's budget is organized by service and categorized into one of these categories, but also high-level metrics are set. We call them indicators, which you can see in non-bold print under the names of the priority outcomes. And these high-level indicators are statistics or metrics used to capture citywide data on an annual basis. So you can see under prioritizing our youth, we measure yearly indicators specific to academic achievement, college and career readiness, and infant mortality. And we keep track in our publications on how well we're doing in progress towards improving the trends around those indicators. And so you can read the other indicators we track in the other priority outcomes areas as well, but we do keep track of these yearly in our publications, again, to make sure that we're dedicating dollars to the right areas in the budget and hopefully are making progress towards improving the trends on these high-level goals that the city wishes to achieve. On the next slide, in terms of where our money goes in the operating budget, so we saw on the previous couple of slides information about the revenue, but in terms of where that money goes in the operating budget, again, if we, organized around those priority outcomes, about 46% of the budget goes towards public safety related programs in the city. The next, largest chunk of money goes towards prioritizing youth programs, make up about 18.6% of the budget in terms of the expenditure planned next fiscal year. About 15% is dedicated to services that fall in the category of clean and healthy communities. About 7.3% falls in the category of responsible stewardship of city resources. That includes a lot of the centralized administrative functions of the city, finance and human resources, for example, and then all other, which includes things like debt service and other centralized fixed costs. On the next slide. So speaking of fixed costs, fixed costs are all those costs in the city's budget that we are required to pay either by law or contract or otherwise, restricted, that we cannot easily reduce in the short term. So these fixed costs include things like contribution to the city's pension systems, healthcare costs for retirees, the city's mandated contribution to Baltimore City public schools, debt service obligations, and other costs such as workers' compensation, utility costs, and tipping fees, for example. And, one thing we measure every year is how much of the budget is dedicated to fixed costs. And we measure this to try and keep track, to make sure that, fixed costs are not rising on a yearly basis so as to crowd out other general fund revenue, so that we can, continue to fund current services, to fund new programs as resources are available, because the more we spend on things like pension and retiree healthcare and debt service, the less funds we have to spend on maintaining or beginning new programs. So it's something we measure here in the budget office. On the next slide, you can see on this chart here, so this is a chart that shows you fixed costs versus revenue each year since fiscal 2009. And so what it shows you is that as revenue has steadily gone up from fiscal 2009 until the current fiscal year, the city has made a number of reforms that have slowly brought the trend line down in terms of what percent of the budget is made up of fixed costs, and that has occurred via a number of long-term planning initiatives to reform pension payments, rebid healthcare plans, and so forth to achieve a more sustainable level of fixed costs as a percent of the overall budget, to ensure again that we have flexible dollars to invest in other programs in the city. On the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget process and, from a high level, what the yearly budget process looks like. So in the fall time, starting in really September and all the way through November, the Department of Finance is crunching numbers. We're looking at what will it cost next year to provide the same level of services as we are currently providing in the city. And so we collect, a bunch of information from the city's agencies, from other data sources, and calculate what is it going to cost to sustain services next year. During that time period, we're also working closely with the mayor's office to identify those key objectives and strategies that the mayor's team wishes to achieve in the next year via the budget. And so we are meeting closely in a series of meetings to begin the work around setting those high-level goals in the formulation of the next year's budget. In December, we're reaching out to agencies and asking them to submit budget proposals for the next fiscal year. When it comes to January through March, the budget team in early January is reviewing budget proposals, followed by a series of recommendations made to the mayor's team, which we review through a series of discussions and make recommendations to the mayor's team, and start to ask for budget decisions. Around March is when the Department of Finance sends the preliminary budget to the Board of Estimates to be approved or for review. And in April, the Board of Estimates is holding hearings with agency heads. The Board of Estimates also holds a taxpayers nights for residents prior to voting on the budget, on the preliminary budget. And in May, the Board of Estimates is asked to approve the total final budget and send it on to City Council to review and approve as well. City Council holds hearings and a taxpayers night as well. And then finally, moving into June, City Council is holding budget hearings and asking for votes on the budget from council members, and sends the budget on to the mayor if they choose to approve the budget. The mayor may not approve the total budget or disapprove of some items and approve the rest. So that's the high level overview of the budget cycle. And the fiscal year starts on July 1st each year. And as we move back into the fall of the next year, the budget cycle starts all over again. So in terms of citizen engagement in the budget process, highlighted in red, there are two examples where residents are, asked to engage in the budget process. We always try to ensure that citizen engagement is not just limited to these two events, and that we're always doing outreach during the year and responding to requests such as this one, which is late in the budget process, but for any organization or council district that requests a presentation on the budget, we're always happy to engage in those conversations as well throughout the year. In terms of high-level financial principles that guide us here in the Department of Finance, we seek yearly to make sure we have a balanced budget as required by our city charter. We're seeking to establish a budget gets the best value for our city revenue via the priority outcomes and the high-level goals set by our mayor. We also seek to ensure that the city is fiscally responsible and healthy. For example, I mentioned the fixed costs. We make sure that those are, remaining steady and are sustainable from year to year. We also, take a look at our bond rating with our partners to make sure that the city has favorable interest rates on debt service, for example, because that's an example of a fixed cost that would otherwise crowd out other spending if interest rates were to be too high due to a lower bond rating, for example. We keep an eye and guide policy on the city's rainy day fund, and also look at our debt ratio. And again, all of these tie into the high-level goal of keeping the city on a sustainable fiscal path from year to year. On the next slide, so we're going to take a look at some of the highlights of the fiscal 2022 recommended budget. On the next slide. So a few highlights. Again, we're presenting the fiscal 22 budget as largely a current level of services budget with targeted investments and funding specific to pandemic recovery, especially from the federal government. So again, it does maintain critical city services. The budget also utilizes $52 million from CARES and FEMA aid to support continuing COVID-19 response into fiscal 22. The budget also kicks off a recycling can initiative with some private support plus city enterprise funds. So the impact on citizens is you should be receiving sometime during fiscal 22 a city recycling can to allow for the systematic collection of recyclables, similar to the city's trash can program that was rolled out several years ago. The fiscal 22 budget also leverages city funds to access some additional state weatherization resources. That's a targeted investment in the Department of Housing and Community Services that the department anticipates being able to enable the completion of 500 additional home projects around weatherization next year. The budget also supports the sewage on-site support program, funded with city enterprise funds for sewage backup incidents per faulty city infrastructure. The budget also funds translation of vital documents across city agencies into other languages to give access to services in multiple languages across the city. And there are funds in next year's budget to continue implementation of the city's switch to a new enterprise resourcing planning system, which is all the systems that are used to do human resources management and fiscal management in the city. It's a big scale project over the course of 3 to 4 years, and so next year's budget sustains funds to continue that program next year as well. On the next slide. So in terms of high-level budget highlights in each of the priority areas, under the priority outcome area of prioritizing youth, there is $360.3 million dedicated to support of city schools in the budget, which includes the city's maintenance of effort payment, which is the local contribution to schools for city schools retiree benefits, our contribution to the school construction programs, as well as school health and crossing guard services. Many of you are familiar with the Kerwin legislation and the changes to that legislation in the last session. Those contributions have been delayed to fiscal 2023. So you don't see Kerwin, city Kerwin funding in the 22 budget, but you can expect to see a large increase in the local contribution required as of fiscal 2023. With regard to the Pratt library system, there are $27.6 million in general funds set aside in the budget to ensure for the healthy and safe reopening of branches. Again, that's the budget for the entire system, but there were funds specific to ensuring that there are more janitorial and cleaning services provided to every branch to make sure that they can maintain a safe environment as they have reopened recently. It also supports, digital library service, including new programs called Books for Me and One Book Baltimore that were rolled out during the pandemic. On the next slide, in the category of building public safety, there are funds in the new Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement that will allow the city to kickstart what is called the Group Violence Reduction Strategy, which is an evidence-based program designed to help curtail violent crime and expand opportunities to build better relationships with police officers in communities. Also, the budget includes an increase to the monthly 911 fee by 25 cents per phone line to support the growing cost of 911 services as part of an effort to upgrade 911 related technology and provide better call routing in the region as it concerns emergency responders to the 911 system. On the next slide, in the area of clean and healthy communities, again, I mentioned previously the sewage on-site support program. The city will do a 12-month pilot program specific to this program, which began in fiscal 2021 and will continue into fiscal 22. And again, this is the program that provides professional cleaning and disinfection services following a sewage backup if the sewage backup is due to faulty city infrastructure at no cost to city residents. I mentioned also the recycling can program. Again, the budget has dedicated $8.3 million to make it possible to roll out recycling cans to every eligible household in Baltimore City. So we're excited about that program being rolled out as well. On the next slide. As it concerns equitable neighborhood and development services, this includes services such as those services offered by the Mayor's Office of Employment Development. It includes over $5.8 million in grant funds to serve about 30,000 residents to continue refining strategies to help residents get a living wage jobs. So they operate career centers and have an intake process to allow them to evaluate residents' needs as it concerns finding jobs and career development. MOED also has a Career Navigators program, which is a partnership with the Health Department. The Health Department, as you might likely know, has a number of temporary staff members that were hired to do things such as contact tracing for COVID. And this Career Navigators program will help provide those temporary employees with potential option continue employment after those services are no longer needed when the pandemic is over, to make sure that they have job skills if needed to continue permanent employment after that time. On the next slide, with regard to responsible stewardship of city resources, again, this includes a category that includes a lot of the city's internal services around IT, human resources, and finance. So one investment in next year's budget is that the city is hiring a director of broadband and digital equity, which will be funded in part by grant support over the course of the next 3 years. And it will focus on how to expand high-speed affordable internet access to over 60,000 Baltimore households currently without this necessity. The budget also includes a $200,000 loan from the city's Innovation Fund loan that will allow our city's IT department to look at the use of automated text messaging or online messaging for the 311 service to respond to routine 311 requests with real-time information and to reduce some call volume pressure on the 311 call center. On the next slide, I'm going to talk for a minute about COVID-19 response and the city's use of federal aid in response to the pandemic. So just to go over the chronology quickly about the history of the federal aid and how it's been used to date. In March of 2020, when the pandemic became a reality, the CARES Act was passed by Congress. So that stands for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. It provided $103.6 million of direct aid to Baltimore City and also provided supplemental funds for disaster relief via FEMA. It provided additional supplemental funds above that $103.6 million for existing grant programs such as CDBG, which stands for Community Development Block Grant Program, and the ESG program, and the ESG grant, which is Emergency Solutions, which largely serves the Department of Homeless Services, for example. The Consolidated Appropriation Act was a second act that passed by Congress in December of 2020. This provided $17.7 million specifically for rental relief to be administered by Baltimore City. This funding was extended to be spent from December of 2020 initially to 2021 to allow for more time to spend those funds and provide critical pandemic relief services. And in terms of new funds that we just recently been made aware of and have been making plans for are the American Rescue Act plans, the ARP funds as we call them. The funds were included in legislation passed by Congress in March of 2021 and will provide an estimated $641.2 million of direct new federal aid directly to Baltimore City. Funding priorities and the process to appropriate those funds over the next several years is currently being developed in partnership with the mayor's office, and more information will be forthcoming. Those funds are new, and so there was not sufficient time to make a full plan in the next year's budget, but we have until December of 2024 to spend those funds, and so we're busy preparing in partnership with the mayor's office to inform a process by which those funds will be spent. On the next page, in terms of where CARES funding has been used to date, just a couple of highlights here. So 8.15 million funds will be used. Sorry, this refers to next year, not where we have spent money already, but in fiscal 2022, 8.15 million of those CARES funds that still remain to be spent will continue to be used to support personnel that have been substantially dedicated to emergency response. So, for example, while the libraries were closed, library personnel was redirected to help with food delivery and other pandemic response purposes. So, for those employees that are still, helping with pandemic response, even though it might not be part of their normal duties, will be able to use funds to support their work. It includes fire EMS personnel, for example, through the end of December. In terms of other city costs for next year, 16.35 million of the funds that remain from the CARES Act will be used for things like technology upgrades to allow for ongoing telework and digital processing of documents, for example, as well as PPE purchases. Also, cleaning and decontamination funds have been set aside, for example, at city libraries, which I mentioned previously, and other public facilities to ensure safety as people begin to return to those facilities as the city reopens. On the next slide. In terms of where FEMA dollars specifically are being directed, so FEMA's funds are reimbursement based, and so the city has to apply for reimbursement funds, and those funds will largely be used to reimburse for costs the city has spent to date around feeding, around sheltering, and other sheltering related activities. The funds will also be used to support mass vaccination sites run by the city. We expect that up to $10 million in FEMA reimbursement will be able to be sought in order to keep running the city's mass vaccination sites through December. On the next slide. In terms of other places where we have plans to spend remaining COVID funds not related to the ARP funds, you can see there is an expectation of receiving an additional 7.9 million in CDBG funds to be directed specifically to pandemic response activities, 2.5 million from the ESG program, an additional 2.75 contribution to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and also Consolidated Appropriations Act emergency rental assistance funds dedicated to eviction prevention, overseen by the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success and the Mayor's Office of Homeless Services. And on the next slide, that concludes our presentation. Happy to answer any questions anyone might have, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mira. Thank you. No, that was very thorough. And a lot of information. So I'm sure folks have questions. I believe we're jumping into question and answers now.
Yep. Hi, everyone. This is David Pontius from the Councilman's staff. Great questions in the chat and pre-submitted on the Google form. So I'll start with a question for BBMR. What timeframe can we expect from Baltimore City regarding services as the pandemic appears to be coming to a close? Is there any increase in the budget to deal with traffic and graffiti or to maintain parks?
Yeah, so I just spoke generally about the city's remaining CARES funds, the FEMA funds, and the upcoming ARP funds. With regard to graffiti, the graffiti funds were restored in next year's budget. It was a service that had to be cut in the current year's budget when the pandemic hit last year in order to balance the budget. But the fiscal 22 budget does restore graffiti removal services, not with federal pandemic funds, but with city general funds. And so we were able to restore that service. I think the other question was regard to traffic. Is that true?
Yep.
In terms of federal relief funds dedicated to traffic, again, in terms of the American Rescue Act plan funds, you know, there could be potential proposals in the future directed to, you know, traffic if there is a connection to pandemic recovery. Those funds, again, are meant to specifically be used in response to the pandemic, but I'm sure there could be reasonable reason to direct those funds toward traffic. There aren't any specific traffic-related efforts underway currently that I'm familiar with as it concerns FEMA and CARES funding, however, but potentially if there's a connection to the pandemic, that funds could be utilized in that way, potentially moving forward.
Mira and David, if I can also add, just there is in terms of, I'm just looking at DOT's budget, there's also capital funding for road reconstruction and rehabilitation projects, and some of that might be traffic. And then also in this General Assembly term, the General Assembly authorized the city to install a speed cameras on I-83. And so those are things that there's capital funding for to install that, just as a traffic related.
Yeah, that's a great point. So not COVID relief funding specifically, but there are absolutely funds both in the operating budget and the capital budget directed towards traffic enforcement and traffic control.
Thanks. So there was another question. I saw a little discussion in the Q&A about the rainy day fund and how, we decide how Baltimore decides to use the rainy day fund and what circumstances that happens. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I think, we can agree that it's been a rainy day recently in Baltimore.
Yeah, absolutely. So the city's, the city charter requires that the city only uses that fund when absolutely necessary, and that all other actions are taken before using those funds to fill a year-end budget gap. And so we've only had to use the rainy day fund several times in the past decade or two. Before the pandemic, use of the rainy day funds tended to be around big scale snow events that the city just didn't have enough funds to cover in terms of snow removal. I believe there was use of those funds in response to the 26th Street bridge collapse. But in general, use of that fund before the pandemic has been minimally used. The city's rainy day fund does have to be used to close the budget gap with regard to pandemics, related spending, more so because of a drop in revenue, especially around parking revenue and tourism related revenue, hotel tax, for example. So the rainy day fund will need to be used to close, that revenue deficit, even beyond the use of federal relief funding. The ARP funds are not restricted from paying back the rainy day fund. The city is required by charter to repay any funds used from the rainy day fund within a certain time period. So we are looking at, how to do that, given that we do need to use funds to close the gap there during the current term. Does that make sense?
Thanks for that. Yep. And this may be more of a political question than a strictly budget question, but someone had asked, have the budget priorities changed with the new administration?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a strictly political question, but each new administration does come in with a new set of priority outcomes and strategic goals. So yes, absolutely.
Thanks. One small question. I know this is somewhat of a recurring question, but has there been any thought about increasing the number of trash pickup days in the city from 1 to 2?
Yeah, I know that question does come up with a fair bit. That didn't come up during the current year discussions with the mayor's team. I know that, this is a service that the city used to have. We, currently have the 1 day for trash pickup and 1 day for recycling pickup. And in the context of the recycling can rollout, there is a hope or aspiration there that, as the city residents have more access to recycling cans, the rate of recycling will increase in the city, with the hope that, the amount of trash in the regular trash pickup goes down. So I think we're gonna, people will be keeping an eye on, the trend there. And if that does achieve one of the, aspirational goals of the program, that may reduce the need for, additional trash pickup. But it has come up in those conversations, but with the current, revenue declines, it wasn't something that was looked at closely for next fiscal year, but it absolutely has come up on a recurring basis, and discussions have generally been had.
Got it. Yeah, sure. So here's one I think for both you at BBMR and the councilman. People are asking about the police budget and what that looks like for the next year. There's been debate in Baltimore and nationwide about that. So I was wondering, maybe BBMR can go first and the councilman can go second with your kind of thoughts on that, what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak generally. We've received a number of questions to date about the increase in the police budget year over year. The increase in the police budget is strictly for fixed costs in the area of healthcare, for example. Citywide, active employee healthcare increased by somewhere in the range of 18 to 20%. And that's just the city's portion of the cost. That increase happened in part as a result of reforms made to retiree healthcare to offer a new plan to retirees. And because the retirees and the active employees are in the same cost pool, savings on the retiree side required increases in the premiums, including the city's portion of premiums on the active side. And also the healthcare plans are calendar year programs versus fiscal year programs. So we expect additional increase in premiums come January of 2022 as well. So that was one big increase in the police budget that, doesn't increase police programs or services, but does require additional contributions into the city's healthcare fund, for example, to pay claims. The second increase, there was a big increase for workers' compensation in the police budget. There was two specific cases that informed our actuaries of the need to increase the police allocation for workers' comp specifically. That's driven by really the severity of claims that have resulted in new obligations, new long-term commitments to employees that were injured on the job in past years. And so two large claims in police specifically require the city to contribute more from the police budget specifically into the workers' compensation funds to pay out those claims for injured employees. So that is what informed that increase. And pension contributions into the F&P, the fire and police pension system, also increased a little bit higher than expected this year. And that's just, we get projections from our actuaries in terms of the amount of funds yearly we need to contribute to sustain current pension programs, largely driven by rates of retirement, salaries, and other trends as it concerns employment in those departments in police and fire. So again, it's largely, current level of service police budgets, but because of the size and scale of the police department, you do see a bottom line increase in the police budget next year on account of those fixed cost contribution changes. I can't speak to the political side. I don't know if Councilman Conway has a response to,
Sure.
the police budget other than kind of the nuts and bolts of the budget side.
Yeah, I think Mira gave a pretty good summation of the reality of the police budget as we know it now. It's effectively maintaining a current level of service for the police department. I think, as we look at the department and look for opportunities to reallocate funds, I think we need to be very, very smart about it. We need to be thoughtful about the things we know we have to do. We're currently under consent decree that requires that we upgrade a number of our systems and services that we have to do by law, by consent decree. And as a result, we still have to make sure that in our budget, we allocate enough funding to do that. As I look at other parts of the budget, the way I'll sort of be looking at it is understanding, what are the results that we've seen and what are the outcomes and approaches that we as a city are looking to employ to improve those results. And if we're not seeing those outcomes, why not? And is that a matter of the budget, or is that a matter of some other issue? But I think when we look into the budget, when we start talking about opportunities to reduce the police budget, we need to be very, very smart about understanding, where that money's coming from. We certainly don't want to cut grant funds. It's a mistake that I think was made in the past, and certainly would not have been made if it wasn't done so quickly. We definitely don't want to make those mistakes. But we want to be thoughtful about making sure the police department can do its job well, meet its core requirements, but then also that, if there are cuts, that those services that the police department is responsible for still have their needs met. Because we all know that the calls will still come, the complaints will still come, and just cutting the police department is not so simple as to resolving the problem. We need to make sure that that the money still addresses those problems one way or another.
Thank you. And I'll switch over to the councilman now. And someone asked sort of a general question, but I think it's really important. What can neighborhoods do and what can neighbors do to get involved and support Baltimore City? And they also asked what initiatives are in the future to deter crime and engage those who are currently squeegee workers.
Sure. So to the first question, I would say get active in your community associations. They're block projects and neighborhood projects, neighborhood cleanups, folks that meet monthly or quarterly. I think if you really want to get engaged in the district, in your city, and your neighborhood, that's where you start. I also would highly recommend that folks utilize 311, whether or not you call in and actually dial 311 or use the application to notify the city of issues that you see within your community, whether it's a dead or dying tree, or street lights out, or trash and dumping, or stray dogs running through the neighborhood. Whatever the case is, the city has a system that is designed to field those complaints and address those complaints. And I would highly recommend. I use it frequently, the 311 app. So I would definitely use that. But just getting out and being involved in your community, going to community association meetings, I think is really important. So my team, my office is always available, and we frequently field complaints and issues, and are able to direct people to resources, from everything from 311 complaints to making sure that folks have some sort of resolution towards unemployment benefits. We see it all in our office. And what was the second question, David?
It was about any initiatives to deter crime and engage those who are squeegee workers. Sure.
So on deterring crime, many folks may be aware of the Woodburn McCabe Safe Streets office. We've been working really closely with that office to help them get off the ground, be fully staffed, and building relationships in the community so that we can get ahead of some of the violence that we saw in the previous months. And now we're there. We're close to that. We're seeing a lot of progress and success. We've gotten them back in their office and otherwise. I think that's really important in making sure that we can get ahead of the violence and not just respond to the violence. And I think that's key towards some of the crime that we see, to get ahead of it and not just respond to it. With regard to squeegee boys, or folks who may be panhandling, I think we have programs in the city such as ROCA and otherwise that are designed to kind of direct folks to jobs and careers and opportunities and get them off the streets, whether it's you panhandling or you're selling drugs. We want to incentivize folks and direct folks to those resources and those programs. I think we also want to make sure that they're properly funded in our budget going forward. When we look at our long-term problems and our long-term solutions, that's where where I think at least some of the major upside is available. I think if we did more of that, we'd see more return.
So we got a couple questions about sort of kind of neighborhood issues, and one of them was about whether there are funds to beautify Wilson Park, whether the city is planning on or open to the idea of having a walking path Chinkapin Park. So I'll lob those to you next.
Sure. So,
Councilman.
yeah, we do have a walking path in Chinkapin Park. I had an opportunity very recently to walk that path with Councilman Dorsey. It borders both of our districts, so it's pretty much done. There's some work they need to undo, effectively moving some trees that were planted in the path and sort of block the path, but it's open, it's available. I think it's going to be a great resource for folks that are looking for a little bit of nature, just in a couple of blocks away from their community. But that project is now done in Chickman Park.
I was also going to add there's money in the capital budget set aside for the Inspire plan. Anyone who's been following the 21st Century Schools program might be familiar with that. So there's $500,000 set aside in next year's capital budget for the Inspire plan, which would include things like fixing broken sidewalks or planting trees or community gardens. In the 4th mile radius surrounding new 21st Century Schools, which would include Walter P. Carter, which recently was finished, I believe, and Govins, which is currently under construction. So I wanted to mention that too. And also, it's not a beautification project per se, but there is the funding in the budget for the Walter P. Carter pool as well, which I know a lot of community members advocated for. Again, there's $400,000 set aside for that new park pool as the result of the construction that went on for Walter P. Carter. So I wanted to mention those two things as well.
Yeah, and so also my office doesn't have direct ability to control those funds, but we're always happy to help direct people to resources, help people apply to resources, and identify resources for neighborhood greening and otherwise. A great example is the Willow Avenue Park restoration that was orchestrated by Rebuilding Together. Those types of opportunities certainly exist, and I encourage folks to come to our office. And if you're looking to improve a park or add a little greenery, that's right up my alley. I'm more than happy to help in that regard, and my team is eager to help in those opportunities.
I also encourage folks to look at the Community Catalyst Grant Program run by the Department of Housing. Keep an eye on the deadlines for that program, because that's another opportunity for community groups to come together and propose projects for their neighborhood, which might include a beautification project, a garden project. There are funds that have been used by other communities and perhaps by your community as well to do small scale neighborhood improvement plans as well. So I wanted to mention that resource as well.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Question on whether the budget has focused on workforce development, and not just workforce development, but bringing more companies and corporations to Baltimore.
Yeah, so I can speak generally to, the role of BDC, the Baltimore Development, Corporation, the quasi, organization of the city that is really dedicated to solely to economic development and attracting new businesses to Baltimore City. I know in speaking with them recently that, the pandemic as, it has affected those efforts as well as many other sectors of the community, but that work, is still going on, of course. And they have, spoken to plans to, specifically speak to the post-pandemic environment in those efforts. And MOED, as you mentioned, does provide job training programs, but it's really BDC that drives, the efforts around business development. Councilman Conway, I don't know if you have anything to add to that specific, to your knowledge as well.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think MOED and the support that they provide, I think, is really important. And I think we'll be looking into ways to make sure that MOED can be as effective as possible, especially given the current economic situation and folks who may be on the edge and are trying to figure out how to get back on track. Leveraging MOED as a resource, I think, is going to be a really important option for folks.
Great, thank you. We do have a question about some legislation that's gone through the council lately. It relates to a bill about security deposit alternatives that was vetoed by Mayor Scott. I'll direct this one to the councilman. You know, I think people are curious about what your thoughts are, kind of post veto now that
Sure,
it will
yeah.
return to the council.
Sure. I've gotten a lot of email, a lot of social media from folks about it, and I want to let folks know that I'm reading all of it and certainly taking all of those considerations into consideration as I make a decision. I'll be making a decision soon. But yeah, really appreciate everyone reaching out and making sure that your voice is heard. Just know that I'm listening.
Got it. And we have a question I see in the Q&A. If we know what the plans are for the Guilford School yet. I'll send that to the councilman too.
Sure. The Guilford School, I don't know the exact date, but the Guilford School it's been surplus and is being put up for sale. The city is accepting bids or essentially proposals on ideas for what to do with the school. That hasn't been put forward quite yet. I think it will happen in the next month. And during that time, the city will vet those proposals and determine which ones they find most attractive before they put out an actual request for bids. So that'll be coming soon. I want to say, like I said, in the next month, likely this will be going public for consideration. But yeah, so it'd still be considered. As I understand, just for a little bit of insight, the Guilford School has to be, because of a covenant, I believe, that's being held by the Guilford community. I believe it has to be used for some educational purpose, but I think that's being interpreted fairly broadly to allow that it not only be used as a school, but some other educational purpose as well. But those are the things that are up for consideration at the moment. I think it has to be used for either an educational purpose or for a residential space. So we'll be getting proposals within the next month or so.
Great. Another question, potentially for BBMR. I'm not sure if you'll know this off the top of your head, but someone's asking, is the concentration of poverty grant that has paid for the salaries of community school coordinators, will that be impacted by not having the Kerwin funding until 2023? If you don't know that, we'll circle back. But
I actually do know the answer to that. The short answer is I think no. So the city, independent of the Kerwin and Blueprint funding, provides funding directly via the Family League for community school coordinators. That's been a part of the budget for a very long time, and that funding remains in the budget next year. The education grant to Family League provides funding for both out of school time funding and community school coordinators. At last count, I believe that funding supported 43 to 44 community school coordinators. And so the Blueprint Kerwin funding, providing additional resources directly to city schools, I can't speak to the impact on their budget. But as far as I can remember, I think the concentration of poverty grants, specifically as published in the initial publications of MSDE, the State Education Department, it appears to me that those appear to sustain those funding as well. So that's, in addition to the city funding, the school district has also hired directly community school coordinators with those funding. So don't quote me on it, but I've been pretty close to following the education funding rollout, and I don't believe there's an impact with regard to changes to that available funding for community school coordinators specifically.
Thanks. Let's see. We have a question about potential improvements to parole and probation. I'll let either of you answer that question, but yeah, it looks like potentially the mayor has has talked previously about wanting improvements to that. I'm not sure if that falls under the budget umbrella, but if either one of you want to take a stab at that.
I'll try, unless Mira, you have a particular budgetary perspective.
Parole and probation, I'm trying to think of who has oversight over that. I believe
That's in the mayor's office, isn't it?
no, can we circle back to that question? I'm trying to remember. I believe the sheriff plays a role, but I'm not sure those funds are directed otherwise by the city or not. I have to come back to that question.
I know historically MOCJ has played a significant role in coordinating efforts. I don't know if money has flowed through MOCJ to help in those endeavors, though. That said, I think, when we look at sort of the cycle of crime, where we have folks who get into crime, get arrested because of said crime, and then end up back on the street and can't adjust and end up resorting back to crime to make ends meet, and then end up back in that same cycle. The question I think is alluding to, how are we making sure that we get the greatest use out of those programs? And I think it's an excellent point to look into. I don't know yet how that's baked into the budget.
I took a quick look. I was reminded of what I thought was the case, which is that that's largely a state function of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Service of the state government. So they have a number of regional offices. So in terms of like the direct services, parole and probation, those would be managed in the state budget, not in the city budget. As the councilman said, MOCJ, now known as MONSE, they changed their name. Does inform on policy at a high level, and sometimes receives grant funding to help coordinate reforms even outside of city government. But in terms of the direct services and reforms to direct services, it's largely a state function. And the sheriff, which is funded by the city of Baltimore, they have a small enforcement role, I believe, but the primary services are provided by the state, not the city. Not that we can't have an impact on policy, but that's where that function lives primarily.
All right, and this might be our final question. Someone asked, and I'll read it here, regarding the cans and addressing jobs, equity, et cetera, what plans are in place to have the manufacturing of the cans based locally? I assume this is regarding the recycling cans. And what are the plans toward the Biden initiative to go electric, and how can Baltimore position itself to be ahead of the curve?
With regard to procurement of the recycling cans, as far as I know, the RFP to get bids on that has not gone out yet. Of course, the city's procurement divisions, are always looking to support locally owned businesses and take that into consideration. But I don't believe that RFP or bid document has gone out yet. I'm not up to date on, local manufacturers of recycling carts, but I'm sure that will be taken into consideration when bids do come in to provide those bins for the city. Regarding the other question about, I'm sorry, what was the other question regarding? It was
about the Biden initiative toward, I think, electric vehicles and things like that.
Do you have a response there, Councilman Conway? It's not something that touches our office really directly, but maybe you've heard a little bit more there.
I don't have any specific information, but I can tell you that is something that my team and I have been talking about very recently so far, as energy usage and so looking at electric vehicles and our cities hopefully transition into the future. So I don't have anything to report out yet, but this is certainly something that we're looking into as a team.
I know in the past, not considered in Biden's new initiatives, but in the past, electric vehicle initiatives in the city have included, for example, installing electric vehicle charging machines in the city's garages. For example, the garage across from City Hall here has, and that has electric vehicle charging stations that was funded via partnerships via the Department of General Services, I recall. But in terms of future initiatives, I don't have any specific budgetary commentary there at this time.
I'll say for now, stay tuned.
That's more precise.
I know the mayor has set, I think, some goals around transitioning city government and the entire city to green energy sources. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe 2030 is the target for city government and 2040 is the target for the city overall.
I think that the state has also the state is put forward, or at least MDOT most recently, as I've seen, has put forward a goal by either 30 or 40 to be completely electric for public transportation options, so that all their buses and otherwise would be completely electric as opposed to using diesel and petroleum products. So I think many folks are looking at this, and as we look at it as a city, there are going to be many considerations there to figure out what we need to do to be ready for that change.
Got it. Well, we are approaching 7:30. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, our panelists and our attendees. So if anyone has any closing words, closing thoughts, go ahead and share.
Sure. I'll close out and thank you, David. And I really want to thank Mira for walking us through the budget, the ins and outs of it. It is a very long, complicated document that comes with many considerations, and really looking forward to digging into it with the rest of my colleagues on the council in a couple of weeks or in a week. So we're just around the corner from that. I also want to thank folks who've attended and asked questions. My office will always be available. Please feel free to email, reach out to us on social media, and otherwise, if you have any additional questions that weren't addressed today, or if there's any way that my team or anyone else is a part of the city can be of assistance to you. So thank you all, and I hope you guys have a great night.
Thank you, everybody. Also, if you have any questions about the budget, feel free to email my team and Mara, who's dedicated to responding to requests from citizens as well. Also wanted to mention very briefly, because it just caught my eye in an email that I just saw in my inbox. There is a email that went out from the Department of Housing regarding Guilford. That question was asked. They have just newly submitted a EOI request and are requesting that people submit ideas for the Guilford property by Tuesday, July 28th. And they are holding a pre-submission conference on Tuesday, June 1st. That's next Tuesday at 5:30. Happy to forward that information that I just saw now in my inbox to Councilman Conway. If anyone has a specific idea or plan for the Guilford building, I just wanted to throw that out there in response to that question. So anyways, I've said enough. Thank you all for being here and appreciate you and your invitation.